As we talked about on the last podcast, the post 9/11 GI Bill is an amazing benefit. It can provide payments for tuition, housing allowance for those pursuing higher education or certification. But there's better ways to use it so that you can get the most value out of it.
Exactly. The value is really relative. It can be worth anywhere from nothing if you never use it, to potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars if you use it at the most expensive schools. So today we're going to talk about some of those things that you can do to make sure you are maximizing the value of this great benefit and some of the mistakes that you want to avoid when you're using the GI Bill.
Welcome to Operation Retirement Readiness, where Amy and Mike, two certified financial planners, talk about how military members can prepare for transition and how veterans can prepare for ultimate retirement. This podcast represents the views of the hosts and any guest. It is for informational purposes only and should not be considered tax, financial, or legal advice. All information is regarded to be from reliable sources. The hosts are not responsible for any losses, damages, or liabilities that may arise from the use of this podcast. This podcast is not intended to replace professional advice.
So, Mike, I know that you wrote a whole blog post about the mistakes to avoid when splitting the GI Bill, and we're using that as a basis of this episode. So we'll link those show notes. And how about you go ahead and kick us off?
Yeah, it was called Mistakes to Avoid When Using the GI Bill, and it primarily centers around when families have multiple people that are trying to use the GI Bill. They're splitting it in some way, either a member, spouse, or multiple kids. And that's when you really see the, errors, if you will, come in to play. If you only got one child, or if you're going to use it and you don't have any children, there's still some things to consider, but there are less ways to kind of optimize usage of it. So the first thing we want to talk about is, what is your goal? Most people are trying to get the pay the least amount of money for an education, and that's really how you get the best value from the GI Bill. Many factors, really, the way that colleges price schools. Different schools have different models of how they will charge you, even though the sticker price says one thing. So there are a lot of things, moving parts within the GI Bill to consider. It makes a lot more sense to dive into this and really understand it before you just split the GI Bill, 50-50 or a third if you have 3 kids or people that are going to use it. So, Amy, what have I missed?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good overview, the point that you made in terms of depends on what your goal is for education. We're sort of operating under the assumption that most people's goal is to pay as little as possible for education, whether you have one child or several children, or you're splitting it with a child for your spouse or yourself. So, that makes a lot of sense in terms of the overview that you gave and the complexity of, paying for college. Just the idea of paying for college and everything that goes into the college cost calculations is very complex all by itself. It's a little bit beyond the scope of this podcast to get into the complexity of the costs of college. But we can get into some considerations that you should reflect on before you go forward in using the GI Bill for one child or several children. And maybe, that can all be distilled by giving you an example. So let's say for the cost of attendance, if you've got your GI Bill, let's say the cost of a school's attendance or the sticker price is $65,000 a year. And that includes room, board, tuition, fees, all of that. If you'd only pay $25,000 because of merit or need-based aid, then that would be the value of the GI Bill. So you basically have the ability to manage what you'd potentially pay because of different income situations or different, merit scholarship situations. This is where GI Bill planning can come in. Now, this is in contrast to how a lot of people sort of approach it. The most common approach is splitting it evenly. So if you've got 2 kids, the full 36 months of benefit then you give each of them 18 months, which would cover roughly 2 years. The other 2 years you just have to figure out. So Mike, I think this brings us sort of to the first error that people make when using the GI Bill.
Yeah, so the first one I like to tell people about is, maybe it's using it instead of for the kids, is using it for them or their spouse, if that could significantly raise their earning potential. So, say the cost of sending your kid to school is $35,000 per year without the GI Bill for, a total of $140,000. I mean, which is still a crazy amount of money over the full 4 years. But if you or your spouse is able to increase annual income by, say, $25,000 per year, with a degree or an advanced degree, and then work 15 more years, that would be almost $375,000 in earnings that you'd have. So even if you had to take loans to finance your son or daughter education while you were going to school and using the GI Bill, over the long haul, you're probably going to make out better by increasing your earnings potential.
I think that's a really good point. And I think it's hard for people to consider that. I think a lot of people are so focused on getting their kids through school, they may put their own education or ability to increase their earnings kind of on the back burner.
Yeah, that's definitely true. So Amy, what's mistake number two?
So number two is not understanding how the student aid index, or basically what you'll be expected to pay out of pocket, could change as your income changes. So the biggest factor on whether you'll qualify for financial aid is the parent's income for the child, right? If your income is going to increase significantly in the future, then it might make sense to wait to use the GI Bill. So as an example, let's say that there's an E7 with two kids. There's a senior in high school and a seventh grader. There's a spouse who is not currently working outside the home, which often happens for service members on active duty. The income that's going to be used on the FAFSA is going to be base pay and bonuses, but it doesn't include BAH. So the oldest child could possibly qualify for some need-based aid. But then fast forward 5 years, this E7 has now retired, has gotten a job that pays 20% more. They're also getting their pension. They've settled down, so potentially the spouse has returned to work. So their household income is much higher, and they are likely to qualify for much less need-based aid, if any aid at all. So they're going to be expected to pay much more out of pocket for the second child's education. If you split the GI Bill evenly, that means that collectively you'd pay, more out of pocket for the second child.
Yeah, complexity around college costs are significant, and people may not just understand that. And so the third mistake is kind of a corollary to that. It's really not understanding the school's funding model. And colleges colleges operate on several different funding models. They list the price, as Amy talked about in one of the previous ones, the total cost of attendance, but most of the time, folks don't pay that. Unless you're a super high earner or have a super significant amounts of assets, you're probably going to qualify for, potentially need-based aid. And then a lot of schools also give out merit aid, which is basically based on the student scores or GPA or things like that. So let's talk about a couple of the different funding models. So the Ivy Leagues, the elite private schools, the top of the top that have these huge endowments, they are basically need blind. They will, whatever, when you fill out the FAFSA pre-application for federal student aid, or most of those elite schools use the CSS profile. When you fill that out, you're going to get a expected family contribution, now called the student aid index, back, and at those top schools, that's what you're going to pay. They don't give, you'll pay based on need. If they determine that you can pay a bunch, you're going to pay that. If they determine you can't, they're going to meet all the need, mostly through grants from the huge endowments they have. They don't give merit aid, so even if they're top of the top best student out there, valedictorian, they do not. They won't get any aid. So um, smaller private schools, they're competing a lot of times against each other to try and get the best and brightest. So they will offer a lot of merit aid. They do the same calculations on the need side, but a lot of times they will also be, fighting to attract those top students. And so if you've got a student that scores super high on the ACT, SAT, or, has a super high GPA, they may get significant aid just based on their scores, even if you don't qualify for, public schools. Typically, you get the in-state discount. A lot of times they, may give a little bit of need-based aid, but, sometimes there's a big gap sometimes between what your family contribution is supposed to be and what they're gonna say you need to pay. So just understanding those different ways and understanding your kids and where they may go. Now sometimes that's harder if you've got a big gap between kids and you don't know, hey, is this one going to try to go to Harvard and this one's going to go to a state school? But if they're close enough and you can kind of project that out of what type of school they may, best fit in, that can allow you to optimize when to use the GI Bill.
Exactly. Now moving on to the fourth mistake, that is not factoring in the basic allowance for housing and the yellow ribbon. So basically thinking about BAH differently and including yellow ribbon in the calculation when you're figuring out how much it'll cost out of pocket. So the BAH, the basic allowance for housing benefit, actually adds quite a bit of value to your GI Bill. The yellow ribbon, likewise. So BAH in schools for larger cities on the East Coast, the West Coast, typically much higher than for, say a Midwestern small town school. So some families will use the GI Bill for tuition for an older child, but then make the child pay for room and board, and then they'll take that BAH and invest it for use for their younger children. Now, for yellow ribbon, the GI Bill only covers the cost of tuition up to the tuition price of the most expensive state school. Many private schools have higher costs, obviously, as we know. And as we discussed in the last episode, the yellow ribbon schools essentially provide additional money that's matched by the VA. So this can be, hundreds of extra dollars, thousands of extra dollars, up to full tuition, and it can make a huge difference in the value of the GI Bill. So keeping this in mind, based in context of everything Mike just reviewed, is a great way to increase the value of the GI Bill to your family.
Yeah, and we went deeper in the yellow ribbon last time, but just making sure you understand that specifically because sometimes there are limits on how many students qualify and or that they'll give out each year, and so just kind of understanding all those things if it is a yellow ribbon school. But yeah, it's a huge additional value. And I kind of hit on the last mistake, but we'll go into it a little more, is, not really understanding the difference between kids and what they may, where they may want to go and, what type of, will they qualify for merit aid. So if you've got, again, somebody that's going after the top school, that's going to be expensive and you're not really going to qualify for need-based aid. If it's a yellow ribbon school, it may make sense to, even if it's the second child, hold all the GI Bill benefits for them just because, the cost could be so, extreme. versus if the other student was, hey, going to go to a state school or, a cheaper school. So that really is one of the key things is trying to figure out ahead of time where the kids may go and how best to use it. So, um, Amy, any other kind of mistakes or things to add as we kind of wrap up?
Yeah, I mean, so not really a separate mistake, but just a foot stomp, a theme that has shown up throughout all the mistakes that we've talked about, and that is looking at things big picture. So instead of, I think a lot of times families are so focused on getting the kids through school, and looking at it, child number one, child number two, child, number n, whatever, however many children you have, getting them through school. I think that the theme has been where mistakes show up is looking at things individually. So looking at an individual child's education and how to fund that individual child's education, rather than looking at the education desires, opportunities that are across the whole family, across a longer period of time, how the income situation is going to change and how that's going to change the cost of education, where kids want to go to school. So basically, the key takeaway is looking at the use of the GI Bill more globally than I think people do. So not a new mistake, but really just a theme that shows up in all the mistakes. So as you're considering how to use your GI Bill, I just encourage you to think a little bit more. I'll use the term globally again, holistically across your family to try and get the most possible value out of your GI Bill. Mike, how would you sort of summarize things?
Yeah, I think the key point is just to really understand what you're going to pay, and really trying to figure that out ahead of time to understand when the best time to use the GI Bill is going to be, because there are definitely different strategies to use based on that. And um, again, it's easy just to split it. It makes it simple, but you could be leaving a significant amount of money on the table by just doing that, and not taking some of these things into account.
Exactly. And just again, summarizing, don't forget to consider your spouse and yourself in the equation um, when you're considering, how to maximize the value of your GI Bill. So not just for kids, but for yourself and your spouse too.
Awesome, Amy. I think that pretty much wraps it up. So appreciate everybody tuning in, and we'll be back in a couple weeks with another new episode.
To get transcripts, show notes, or more information, go to operationretirementreadiness.com. Have a question or topic for the podcast? Send it to info@operationretirementreadiness.com. Find out more about Amy and Mike at their websites. Amy is the founder of Instar Financial Planning, LLC. She is retired from the U.S. Army and has worked in the financial services sector since 2019. She's a certified financial planner, a chartered federal employee benefits counselor, and a chartered retirement planning counselor. You can find out more about Amy at instarfp.com. Mike is the founder of Next Mission Financial Planning, LLC. He retired from the U.S. Air Force and has worked in the financial services sector since 2021. He is a certified financial planner, chartered financial consultant, and a certified college financial consultant. You can find out more about Mike at nextmissionfinancialplanning.com.